What's up, guys? Today I'm going to be looking at a video by an atheist known as Genetically Modified Skeptic. And this video is about why he left Christianity and became an atheist. I'm going to listen to his reasons and I'm going to be critiquing them along the way, sharing whether or not I think they are good reasons for doubting Christianity or becoming an atheist, or if I think they're not good reasons, sharing where I think the problems in his logic lie. So let's go ahead and dive right into the video.
Even with as many videos, interviews, and podcasts as I've done where I've talked about how I became an atheist, I don't feel like I've ever produced a single piece of media that I could just show anyone to tell them the whole story. Although it would be impossible for me to spell out or even remember every detail of the story, I like to do my best to summarize it. I know that hearing other people's stories about leaving religion and becoming an atheist has helped me understand that I'm not alone or totally misunderstood in my own experiences. So, in sharing my story, I hope to offer some camaraderie and understanding to anyone else who may need it. I was raised independent fundamental Baptist and my family was very devout.
Hold it right there. Independent fundamental Baptist. That's very interesting because I actually went to an independent fundamental Baptist university for my undergraduate degree. And so I'm sure I'll be able to understand a lot of where this guy is coming from. Just for those of you who don't know, independent fundamental Baptists have some very strict beliefs. They are KJV only, which means they only use the King James translation. They think that's the only translation you should use. I actually once heard a pastor at my school talking about other translations, and he referred to the NIV as the HIV. And then he was like, oh, I mean the NIV. But they're all infected, talking about modern translations. So, yeah, the KJV only, all of the women wear skirts that go down at least to their knees or longer. They are against drinking alcohol. They believe in cessationism, which means that they don't think that the gifts of healing, tongues, or prophecy continue today. Which I know there are a lot more denominations than just independent fundamental Baptists that believe some of these things. But they have some very strict views, like they don't allow, or at least at my university, they didn't allow us to have playing cards, they didn't allow us to go to the movie theaters or watch movies. So there are a lot of strict rules with independent fundamental Baptists, so I can understand what he means when he says that his family was very devout. This is like in a very much stronger sense than most people think of when they think of devout Christians. But let's keep going in the video.
Strongly believed in creationism, the inerrancy of the Bible, homosexuality being an abomination, the end times being near, and most of all, in receiving salvation from burning for eternity in hell for our sins by accepting Jesus Christ as our personal Lord and Savior. I believed all of it completely. I absolutely thought that I had a personal relationship with God, and I was well read in Christian apologetics and strongly maintained my faith beyond my teenage years and even into my early 20s. I went to a Christian university where my faith was always affirmed. I was surrounded by devoted Christians. I went to chapel 3 times a week and church once a week and did devotions in every class. I started college in 2012 and my beliefs were not challenged in any way until I took an astronomy class in summer of 2014. The professor there was a devoted Christian, and while he constantly encouraged his students to embrace Christian ideas, he didn't teach the universe was created in 6 days about 6,000 years ago like most fundamentalists believe. I won't bore you with too many details, but in that class I learned for myself how to measure the age of the universe by multiple means and realized that the universe was closer to 13.8 billion years old than to 6,000 years old. I learned that performing various measurements on bright sources of light tells us what elements give off that light, how the wavelength of that light has been affected by its movement toward or away from the Earth, and since we know the speed of light in a vacuum, how far away the light source is and how long its light took to reach us. I calculated the age of the universe myself in that way, and by methods involving the expansion of the universe and the cosmic microwave background radiation. Scientists were right about the ancient universe. For more details on this, check out the SciShow Space video in my sources.
By the way, at my university, my independent fundamental Baptist university, they also affirmed young Earth creationism, that the universe was created in 6,000 years. And I was surrounded by people who thought that if you are a Christian and believe the Bible, you have to believe this. In a recent video that I made called Should We Take the Bible Literally?, I explained how there are lots of places in the Bible that we don't take literally, like prophetic portions, poetic portions. There are quite a lot of places, Jesus' parables, places that we don't take the Bible literally. And so I showed that if someone takes the Bible, takes Genesis literally, the creation story, or doesn't take Genesis literally, it's overall irrelevant to whether or not Christianity is true. So in my opinion, I could imagine someone reading it and taking it literally or not taking it literally, and I don't think that this should have too big of an effect on your faith. I understand why it does if you grow up in an environment where you think that you have to believe that, but once you realize that there are other readings of Genesis that don't take it literally but still derive lots of theological truth from it, to me, I don't think that this should be a make or break it issue regarding your faith. So yeah, I'll continue the video.
Finish that class, I stopped believing in a young universe and six-day creation, although I still believe in the inerrancy of the Bible and that God created all life in its current form. I was still a fundamentalist in every way except for my belief in the ancient universe. Even though this didn't mesh with my belief in biblical literalism and inerrancy, I didn't allow myself to ask any further questions about Christianity or creation at that point. I decided to rely on faith to affirm my understanding of God's Word and that it was true. My beliefs in that regard remain the same for quite a while. While the next few elements of this story may sound irrelevant or random right now, I assure you that they're important. Not long after my astronomy class in mid-2014, my family began using, selling, and teaching classes about essential oils. I attended those classes, was supportive of them, and believed their claims that essential oils had healing properties. Later, in the fall of 2014, I began taking my first semester of a 2-semester class in statistics and scientific research methods. That class taught me how to avoid cognitive biases, avoid fallacious reasoning, isolate variables, establish causal links, and perform many other essential functions in conducting scientific research. Basically, it taught me the basis of the scientific method, how to apply it, how peer review works, and how to think critically about any problem. As a result of my newfound critical thinking skills, I stopped believing in the validity of personal experience as reliable evidence for one's claims, so I no longer considered my personal experiences of feeling God's presence as reliable evidence for the validity of my beliefs.
Let me pause him right there. So he says he learned not to use personal experience to base his faith on. Now, I think that there should be an important distinction made here. There are two kinds of personal experience. There is anecdotal evidence, which is external personal experience. So that is things in the universe outside of yourself, outside of your own mind. And I agree that we shouldn't rely on those types of personal experiences to make broad conclusions. For example, if you encounter one person who doesn't like blonde-haired people, or if I encountered someone like that, then it would be wrong of me to assume that all people don't like blonde-haired people. That would be using one personal experience to make broad conclusions. Instead, I should look at statistics that say what percentage of people don't like blonde-haired people. So this is anecdotal evidence. However, there are some kinds of personal experience I think that we can trust more than scientific data. And this would be internal personal experiences. So let me explain the reasoning. This gets a little bit complicated, but basically, the one fact that humans can know for sure is our own existence and the existence of our own consciousness. We can't know things outside of our body for sure because we are reliant on our senses to give us that information, and we have to trust that our senses are giving us reliable information. So for example, if I see a tree, I have to trust that my eyes are accurately telling me that a tree is there. Now, this relies on kind of like a middle step that I have to trust. So it's impossible to know for certain. Some people hallucinate things, and so they perceive things with their senses that are inaccurate. Likewise, there are theories like the matrix or the Boltzmann brain hypothesis or the brain in the vat hypothesis. There are theories where it's possible that our brains are receiving completely false information and that nothing around us that we perceive actually exists. Now, I believe it does exist, but I think that you can't know it for certain. I think you can rationally believe that it exists, and I do believe that the external universe exists, but I don't think I can know it for certain. The only thing I can know for certain is my immediate conscious experience. Because I don't indirectly perceive it, I directly perceive my conscious experience. And so it's impossible for me, as Descartes said, it's impossible to doubt one's own existence while one doubts. Meaning that the mere fact you are doubting your existence proves you exist because it takes you to doubt. And so I think that we can know our own individual conscious experience for certain. I can know that my consciousness exists. And therefore, my own personal experience can yield I guess stronger pieces of evidence regarding God than external scientific data. So for example, if God were to reveal himself to my consciousness directly, then I could know that God exists stronger than through any external proofs, through science. And so I disagree with Genetically Modified Skeptic in saying that we can't rely on our own personal experiences, but we have to trust like scientific data, because scientific data makes assumptions like that the universe exists and that the things that we are testing actually exist, whereas personal experiences relies on the idea that your conscious experience exists, and this is one of the very few things that we can actually know for certain exist. So I do think that you can rely on personal experiences if you have a revelation from God and God reveals his presence to you. I think that this is actually a stronger form of reason for believing than from some sort of external evidence. But I'll get back into the video.
As with any personal experience, it was impossible to isolate the factors involved, which definitely caused my sensation of God's presence, so I couldn't honestly conclude that I knew that God was involved in them at all. I go into much more detail about this in a video I've linked in my sources. Another result of my critical thinking skills and ability to recognize good quality scientific research was my doubt of the efficacy of essential oils. There were several arguments used in the defense of the claims that essential oils have extensive healing powers, and I began to see through all of them. For example, personal experiences with them did not constitute reliable evidence. The fact that they've been used for thousands of years for all types of things does not establish their efficacy, but only their antiquity. Research touted to prove their efficacy is either irrelevant, of very poor quality, or preliminary. If you want more detail, I've debunked 7 of these arguments in one of my earliest videos, link in the sources. Keep in mind that through all of this, my beliefs surrounding God and Christianity remain basically unchanged. Then things finally got shaken up for me again when I took a master's level course in human sexuality in mid-2015. There, I learned that there was a strong genetic component to homosexuality, that it tends to run in families, that it's increasingly likely to be expressed by men with older brothers, that it appears uncaused by any set of life experiences, etc. I also learned that sexual orientation can't be changed with any known form of treatment or abuse. If you want more information on this, Shannon Q made a great video about it, link in my sources. That made me realize that if being gay was a sin like I thought, it was the only sin I knew of that God designed as a built-in feature in some humans that could not be changed with any level of effort. Sure.
Okay, so this is a very important topic. He says it's the only thing that is built into humans genetically that cannot be changed with any amount of effort. And so it would be unjust of God to basically have a commandment against people that goes against their most basic biology. Now, this is a tricky debate because it's such a controversial topic, whether or not the Bible condones homosexuality. I've studied under some professors of Paul, Pauline scholars, who argue that Paul was against homosexuality, and I've studied under some Pauline scholars who condone and affirm homosexuality. I'm not going to share my own personal views just because when you share your views on something, on a topic that is so controversial, people tend to kind of put you in a specific box, and I don't want that to happen. So I do have strong views about this issue, but I'm not going to share those in this video. But I am going to address his argument, so he is assuming that the Bible does not condone homosexuality. So for the sake of argument, we're going to take his position. The Bible doesn't condone homosexuality. Now, he says that he can't think of any other area where God would basically genetically build something into you and then hold you accountable for it and ultimately condemn you for it. But he seems to be taking the identity of the person as the thing that God would be judging in this view. But most Christians I know who don't support homosexuality would say it's actually the actions of the people, not their identity. And so there are plenty of other scenarios I can think of where we are genetically geared to want to do things that are immoral. So for example, before marriage, people are geared sexually to be attracted and want to sleep with women. I know men are, I know I was. So you have the desire biologically instilled in you, but it would be immoral to do it. Likewise, even after you're married, you still have the biological desire to sleep with attractive women, but it would be immoral to do it with anyone except for your spouse. And so we do have things built into us biologically that we want to do, but that would be immoral. Same with if you are hungry, and let's say you're in a situation where you don't have the resources to pay for food, you're hungry, it would be immoral to steal food, even though biologically you are built to want food. So I'm not saying that any of these situations compare or are on the same level with how hard it would be to be a homosexual and restraining yourself, because you don't have any way to, I guess, alleviate that desire, whereas the Bible would condone straight people from getting married. So I'm not saying that these things are comparable. I'm just showing that the idea that we are biologically geared towards doing something proves anything bad about God. I think that is a weak argument, because there are plenty of examples where people are biologically geared towards desiring something that is immoral, and most Christians would just say that this is part of the corruption that happened at the fall. God did not intend for things to be like this, but it's because of human sin that things resulted like this. So I don't think that's a good reason for doubting Christianity or doubting the existence of God.
Sin was our nature, but even sins like substance addiction could be overcome with enough work. Being LGBT, though, meant that God designed you to constantly sin with no way to stop, and then he punishes you for that sin as if you could have stopped. This brought old questions about Christianity into my mind after I had suppressed them for over a year, but I still refused to address them and continued suppressing them the best that I could. In 2015, I had become incredibly interested in science, likely because I finally understood its methodology well. That led me to take interest in studying the theory of evolution. Now, I definitely didn't believe in evolution, as creationists like Kent Hovind and Ken Ham had taught me that it wasn't a science, but I thought, I understand science well enough now that I should be able to know my enemy by studying evolution, all while seeing through it for the pseudoscience that it is. As you might expect any honest, scientifically literate person to do at that point, I quickly learned that evolution by natural selection is an incredibly rigorous and well-evidenced theory worthy of being the central theory to the entire field of biology. I had been taught that there were no transitional fossils, which is false. I was taught that structures like the eye couldn't have evolved because they're irreducibly complex, which is false. I was taught that no evidence points to animals existing more than 6,000 years ago, that all signs point to intelligent design, that PhD creationists are prolific scientists who are unfairly discriminated against, and that evolution is unproven because it's just a theory. All of those points are false and are propagated out of a severe misunderstanding or total ignorance of evolution. Proof of all of this is in my sources. Finally,
So it sounds like he is going back to Genesis again. He was told that you have to have a certain interpretation of Genesis, and then when he studied the science, it didn't seem to match his own interpretation of Genesis, and so he started having doubts about the Bible as a result, or even about Christianity as a result. But again, there are plenty of Christians who take theological truth from Genesis, but don't take the creation story literally, in the same way that they don't take certain prophetic material or poetic material or parables literally throughout the Bible. And I don't see how this should be that big of a problem for Christianity, whether evolution is true or is not true. To me, it seems like an irrelevant issue that kind of gets people sidetracked a lot of the time. So Yeah, I understand where he's coming from in that if you've been told your whole life that evolution isn't true, and then you research it and you come to the conclusion it is true, that could maybe create doubts. But I think that his doubts are unfounded because the truth of evolution is irrelevant to the truth of Christianity. And so I think that, yeah, he doesn't have a rational reason for doubting, though I understand psychologically why he is doubting. But let's continue.
Understood that scientists were right about evolution, just like they had been right about the age of the universe. It didn't take long from this point for me to realize that no intelligent designing force was necessary to explain the existence of life in its current form. This opened the floodgates for questions and doubts about Christianity and the existence.
Whoa, that was a leap. He said it didn't take long for him to understand that no intelligent life force was necessary to create this universe or life. I think that's a bit of a stretch. Countless scientists have pointed to the fact that the universe does indeed seem fine-tuned for life. The exact amount of the weak force in the universe, or the amount of entropy, or the strength of gravity, or the initial conditions of the Big Bang. Scientists agree that all of these exact quantities were appear to be fine-tuned for the existence of life. So I think it's a bit of a stretch, and the fact that he said it didn't take long before he realized that no intelligent mind was necessary to create this makes it seem like maybe once his views on evolution came crashing down, he kind of skipped some necessary areas of research to make the conclusion that no intelligent designer is necessary for the life that we have in this universe.
Of God. Still, I didn't want or plan to address any of them. They buzzed around in my head constantly, but I tried to ignore them because I was just afraid to reconsider my beliefs because they were so important to me. Besides, I thought, what's the harm in believing the way I do, even if I'm wrong? It was then fall of 2015 and my last semester of college. One day, a family member who sold essential oils sparked up a conversation with me about the science behind their use as medicine. I knew that supposed science was total bunk, as I was the only one in my family who understood the scientific method or the research process, and I began asking them questions about what they were presenting me. I won't lie, I wasn't very nice about it. I stated multiple times that their false beliefs about medicine could encourage wasteful or even fatal life decisions. They couldn't answer any of my questions sufficiently and ended up retreating to a point where they defended all of their beliefs about essential oils with personal experience alone. I pointed out how personal experience was unreliable. Their response was to tell me that they just couldn't let go of their personal experience even if it wasn't solid evidence. This baffled me, so I asked them why they felt that way. They said that their personal experience was so important to them that reconsidering their beliefs would be frightening and painful.
Again, when he's talking about personal experience right now, he's talking about external personal experience or anecdotal evidence. And I do agree with him that when we are coming up with things like medicine or things that apply to the natural sciences, personal experience is not the way to go, but instead we need to use inductive reasoning to come to our conclusions.
Besides, they said, what's the harm in believing the way I do, even if I'm wrong? As soon as they said that, I realized I was guilty of the same irrationality in the case of my Christianity. I didn't know if being Christian was as irrational as believing essential oils were scientifically proven to have extensive healing powers, but I did know that I had never allowed myself to explore all the questions I had. Finally, I opened up to questioning everything unapologetically. I prayed and told God that I needed to think about these questions freely, but that I thought if he was really there and Christianity was true, my honest inquiry would help me find him in every line of evidence I would explore. I decided to temporarily go off any media that could influence my thinking. When I felt a bit more clear-headed, I would end that media blackout. The media blackout served two purposes. One, I knew that if I stopped believing, my whole family would tell me that it was because I blindly followed some worldly person, so I needed to make sure that wouldn't happen. Two, I thought that if God was fundamental to all existence, and if people in the past who lack access to information that we have now were expected to believe in God or else be damned, I should be able to find God on my own through pure reason like they were expected to. So over the course of 4 months, I spent as much time as possible deliberating over the validity of Christianity and theism. The questions I remember pondering the most are, could the power of an omnipotent God justify logical contradictions in his word versus his creation? Could I reasonably interpret the Bible differently than I had been taught? How can we reliably determine factual information about the supernatural? And was faith ever a reliable method of determining truth? The answer to the first question was yes.
So he said, could there be contradictions between creation and God's word if God is omnipotent? Now, this is a tricky question because people often misunderstand God's omnipotence. Omnipotence means that God is all-powerful. It doesn't mean that God is all-able. It doesn't mean that God could break the laws of logic. For example, God couldn't build a rock that is too large for God to carry, because if God is all-powerful, God would then be able to carry it. Some Christians get tripped up by this and they just say, no, God could do it, but they don't have an explanation how. The easy answer is that God is all-powerful. God has as much power to do anything physically that he wants to do, but this does not mean that he's all-able. He can't make 1 + 1 = 3 because that's a logical contradiction. And so there couldn't be, if God is completely honest, there could not be a contradiction between what God says and what is true. So I disagree with him that I disagree with Genetically Modified Skeptic that could be the case.
An omnipotent God could justify anything, even logical contradictions. So sure.
I disagree. He couldn't justify logical contradictions. Logic is not something that was created. This is where a lot of people get tripped up. They think that God created logic, but logic is not itself a thing. We think of logic as a thing because it's a noun. And so when we take ideas and we turn them into nouns, we often think of them as things. But instead, logic is a method of figuring out truth. It's not a physical thing that was created. Logic is a natural byproduct of existence. Whenever anything exists, logic is there because, for example, you can't have one of the laws of logic is the law which states that something can't both exist and not exist at the same time. And so that's one of the foundational logical laws. Something can't both exist and not exist at the same time. That law is a byproduct of existence. If something exists, then it can not at the same time not exist. So logic automatically pops into existence. It's not a physical thing that exists, but logic is there whenever existence is there. So when God created anything, logic was naturally there, but it's not as though God created logic. Logic is just a byproduct of creation or existence. And so when you say that God can't break the logical laws, it's not so much saying something God can't do. It's just it's basically a play on words because we're treating logic as a noun when really it's not. Well, it's not. It's a noun. It's not a thing.
Sure, God could create a universe that could be demonstrated to be ancient, but really isn't, or do anything else which violates the laws of logic. The problem with invoking an omnipotent God in order to justify logical contradictions in a belief system, however, is that it can be done to justify literally anything. One can invoke an omnipotent God to justify any nonsensical idea within any religion or belief system, not just Christianity.
And this is false because, as I stated, God can't break the laws of logic, and therefore God couldn't. You couldn't justify anything that's illogical using God.
This puts every idea imaginable, no matter how absurd, on equal footing. Because of this, it gives no more explanatory power to Christianity than to any other religion, and is useless for building a case for anything.
That's again false because it is falsifiable. Since God can't break the laws of logic, we can use logic when we are searching for God, and so it is wrong to say that it is non-falsifiable.
On to question 2 then. Could I reasonably interpret the Bible in some other way than I had been? Probably. I had a minor in Bible by that point, and I understood how various literal and figurative interpretations came to be. I could probably find more metaphysical interpretations that meshed with my understanding of science. That thought, though, made me realize that given how many biblical interpretations exist, a lot of people, no matter how hard they try, misinterpret and misunderstand the Bible. This collection of books was supposed to be divinely inspired, yet it was just as likely to be misunderstood as any other text.
Number one, most people who believe in inspiration don't say that this means that that interpretations are also inspired. It makes sense that there would be lots of interpretations because that's people interpreting, not God interpreting it for them. So I don't see how that's a problem. He seems to be misunderstanding the doctrine of inspiration, which has nothing to do with God inspiring people's interpretations, but instead has to do with God inspiring the authors. Second of all, inspiration is not a core doctrine of Christianity, meaning that you don't have to believe in the inerrancy and inspiration of the Bible in order to be a Christian. Christianity centers on God's revelation through the person Jesus. And so you have to believe in Jesus to be saved. To say that believing the Bible is completely true or inerrant in order to be saved is actually bibliolatry, which means turning the Bible into an idol, like idolatry. And so you're adding something to what is needed for salvation that the Bible itself doesn't say is needed for salvation. The Bible says just Jesus. You just have to believe on Jesus in order to be saved. So he has two flaws here in saying that he would naturally expect that people would all come to the same interpretation of the Bible if it were inspired. That doesn't make logical sense. And even the Bible's inspiration itself is not required for Christianity to be true, which he assumes that the Bible does have to be inspired for Christianity to be true, and so he is misunderstanding the requirements for Christianity to be true.
Whether you're Christian or not, you can probably agree on these premises. The Bible is understood very differently even by people who read it with the best of intentions, and some of those people base harmful actions upon their understanding of the Bible. The issue is then that if the Bible really is God's word, he chose a method of communication that would be so subject to interpretation that it would inspire even its genuine students to carry out harmful actions in what they understood to be obedience of God's word. This reveals a flaw in God's supposed nature.
Again, as I showed, it doesn't show a flaw in God's nature because both of his premises were false.
If God is omnipotent and omniscient, then he chose to confuse his followers with the Bible and isn't omnibenevolent. If he was omnipotent and omnibenevolent, then he failed to realize that the Bible would confuse his followers, so he isn't omniscient. If he was omniscient and omnibenevolent, then he knew that the Bible would confuse his followers, but he just couldn't do any better, so he isn't omnipotent. I realize that this paradox could not be logically resolved with both God's perfect nature and his authorship of the Bible intact. With the Bible's inability to communicate its message more precisely than any other man-made book, its inerrancy is falsified.
That's not true. Jesus himself said, the Gospels say that Jesus purposefully spoke in parables because he wanted people who didn't have their hearts attuned toward God to misunderstand his message. So it makes sense that there would be lots of people misunderstanding God's revelation.
Appears no differently than any other natural piece of literature. I had to conclude that uninspired men wrote the Bible. I then moved on to question 3. How can we reliably determine factual information about the supernatural? I knew by that point that science was based on methodological naturalism, which is basically the resolution to investigate the natural and not make explanatory claims involving the supernatural. This is done because, by the definitionally limitless and unintelligible nature of the supernatural, assertions of supernatural causes of any event could never be falsified in study.
That's not true. Supernatural claims can be falsified. If someone claims that they have the superpower to turn invisible, that could easily be falsified if you tell them to try it and they're not able to. If someone claims that they, if someone claims that they flew, if they say to you that they were floating in their room, for example, and you happen to have a video camera in the room, you could go check the video and see if they were flying, and if they weren't, you would have falsified their supernatural claim. Supernatural claims are easily falsifiable. What he is talking about is methodological naturalism, which says you can never posit a supernatural explanation, but always have to find a natural explanation for any phenomena. Now, this is actually biased against the supernatural. If you're trying to figure out, like he said he was, whether or not the supernatural exists, you don't want to use methodological naturalism because it starts by assuming the supernatural doesn't exist and always seeks for a natural explanation, no matter how improbable that natural explanation is, even if the natural explanation is more improbable than a supernatural explanation. And so he didn't exactly use the best methodology for trying to investigate whether or not supernatural claims are true or whether or not the supernatural exists.
Remembering this about the scientific method was what I needed to answer this question. While refraining from exploring supernatural ideas, science has made enormous progress in building humanity's knowledge of the world, as demonstrated by our continuously advancing technology. Meanwhile, supernatural claims, being definitionally unfalsifiable, all stand on equal footing right now, just as they always have.
They're not unfalsifiable.
It became obvious to me that we simply don't have any reliable way to test or measure anything supernatural. We're limited to our knowledge of the natural, whether we like it or not.
He says we don't have any way to test things that are supernatural. Now, this might make sense when you're talking about the scientific method, which uses inductive reasoning. Basically, you have to have lots of repeated examples of something when you're using inductive reasoning to determine or make predictions about the way things are or the way things will continue to be. So it makes sense that the scientific method wouldn't be great at testing the supernatural, since the supernatural is notoriously unpredictable and not repeatable. But there are lots of other ways of finding truth outside of the scientific method. For example, we know mathematical truths, like I know that 1 trillion plus 1 trillion equals 2 trillion, even though I've never tested that scientifically. I know it's true, and so mathematical reasoning can lead to truths that the scientific method won't get you. Likewise, we can make historical statements like George Washington existed. You can't prove that through the scientific method because it's not. You can't test it, or you can't repeat it. And so we can know historical things, mathematical things. I think there's a whole lot of different ways. We can use deductive reasoning to know things for certain. Deductive reasoning actually leads to things that you can know 100%, whereas the scientific method will only ever get you probabilities. So just by saying that the scientific method can't test the supernatural, therefore the supernatural doesn't exist, I think that's flawed reasoning, because there's lots of other kinds of evidence, such as testimonial evidence, which can be stronger even than inductive evidence. And so I think he kind of fell short when trying to test whether or not the supernatural exists.
Finally, I asked myself if faith was a reliable way to determine truth. One definition of faith I considered was simply reasonable trust, and the other was the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Given the reasoning that I had already gone through prior to asking this question, I didn't think that I had a good reason to trust God. If he would have me believe in him based on things that, to the best of my reasoning, had determined to be absurdities, then he didn't have my best interest at heart. I couldn't trust him.
Well, if your reasoning was flawed and illogical, then yes, he had your best interest at heart. But if we use correct reasoning, correct logic, and we get to the correct truths, this is the way things are supposed to be. When you use flawed reasoning, of course you're going to end up with incorrect conclusions.
Still, though, I could believe in him based on faith by the second definition. However, that would consist of me excusing multiple logical absurdities in favor of belief, and then asserting that the fact that I believed was evidence enough for me. I
agree that you should never believe something blindly, and I think that's what he's talking about with the second definition, blind faith, though I say that he's misinterpreting that Bible verse in coming up with that definition. Faith itself just comes from the Greek word pistis, which comes from the verb pisteuo. So pisteuo means believe. The noun form is pistis, so faith literally just means belief. It has no connotations as to whether or not belief is based on evidence or not. And in my opinion, whatever you believe should always be based on evidence. I never want to assume anything. I want to base every single one of my beliefs on evidence. And so I don't think that the Bible teaches that you should blindly believe in Christianity.
Realize that any idea imaginable can be believed to be true or false on faith, and if faith is a reliable way of determining truth, then that means that all imaginable ideas are both true and false as evidence.
Faith is not a reliable way of determining truth. Faith just means belief. So belief is not a way of determining truth. Hopefully your belief is in the truth, but it's not a way of determining truth. We use logic and evidence to determine the truth.
By faith. Faith, I understood, was logically absurd. Once I answered this final question, I felt I had cleared my head enough to consult outside sources. I was most interested in studying Christian material because I hoped that there was still a way that I had been mistaken about Christianity. I turned to the work of William Lane Craig, Lee Strobel, and C.S. Lewis especially. I studied up on arguments such as the Kalam cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, etc. One by one, I refamiliarized myself with these arguments that I had learned previously, and one by one, I found serious logical flaws in them. Instead of going through all of those here, there's a video playlist in my sources where Cosmic Skeptic represents my understanding of all of these arguments very well.
I do think that those arguments are strong. The cosmological argument, teleological argument, moral argument, etc. I think they are strong. He says he's not going through them here in this video, but the name of the video is, This is Exactly Why I'm an Atheist. That's the name of the video. So you would think in this video he would give the reasons of why he's an atheist. So if he's an atheist because he debunked those arguments for God, then it's surprising he didn't give that evidence in this video. So I can only assume that the things he talked about in this video are also reasons why he's an atheist. And as I showed in this video, none of the reasons that started causing him to doubt are logical reasons for doubting Christianity. Don't get me wrong, it's completely understandable why someone with misconceptions about what it means to be a Christian and what the Bible teaches, it's perfectly understandable that having those beliefs shaken up would cause you to doubt. And I've gone through similar experiences where I started doubting Christianity because I was shaken up in some of my core beliefs, but ultimately his reasons for starting to doubt aren't logical. They're understandable psychologically, but they're not logical. And so I don't think that in this video he presented a reasonable case for why someone should be an atheist, and I don't think he demonstrated that his reasons for becoming an atheist are reasonable. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe, smash that like button. If you have any comments or you want any clarifications on anything that I said, be sure to comment them down below, and I'll catch you in the next video.